On a brisk Tuesday morning at a renowned state university, the lecture hall hummed with subdued excitement. Students shuffled into their seats amid the rustle of faded notebook pages and the quiet clack of laptop keys, unaware that today's lesson would redefine more than just integrals. In walked Professor Cartwright, a figure of austere authority whose silver-rimmed glasses and steely gaze silenced even the most self-assured among them. Her reputation for uncompromising precision and an iron discipline preceded her, leaving no room for error or excuse. As she strode confidently to the front, her heels clicking decisively against the tiled floor, she snapped a piece of chalk between her fingers with a flourish that brooked no challenge. "All right," she intoned, brushing a stray blonde lock from her face. "Last session we delved into multivariable limits. Today, we advance to Laplace transforms." With that, she began inscribing sprawling, intricate equations upon the board, each symbol meticulously rendered, every line a challenge in its own right. Students scrambled to capture her every stroke, some absorbed in a maze of unfamiliar notation, others feigning understanding. In the midst of this controlled chaos, a lone figure sat quietly near the center. Daniel Reed, tall, lean, and clad in a simple hoodie and jeans, appeared almost indifferent. While most of his classmates wrestled with the swirling symbols, his keen eyes scanned the chalky script with the ease of someone reading a well-loved book. It wasn't that he struggled, on the contrary, numbers, patterns, and equations unfurled before him like a familiar dance. Yet something prickled at his attention, a subtle misstep in the transformation, a minor error that no one else seemed to notice. Before he could dismiss it, a timid voice from the front row, barely above a whisper, ventured, "Professor, I think there's an error in the second line." The query, laced with uncertainty, hung in the charged air. Professor Cartwright's eyes narrowed as she slowly arched a brow, her tone sharp with indignation. "An error," she repeated, as if the very suggestion was an affront. After a quick scan, a dismissive smirk curved her lips. "There's no error," she declared flatly, reducing the student to a blush of humiliation. Yet Daniel's conscience would not let the mistake pass unnoticed. Quietly, yet with unyielding resolve, he raised his hand. "There is an error," he stated calmly, his voice slicing through the tension. A ripple of murmurs surged among the students as all eyes shifted in his direction. The professor's expression remained impassive for a heartbeat, then, with a flicker of irritation barely concealed, she challenged, "Enlighten me, Mr. Reed." Without a trace of arrogance, Daniel rose and made his way to the board. The room seemed to press in around him as he grasped the chalk, a simple tool that now carried the weight of expectation. With deliberate, smooth strokes, he erased the misapplied term and rewrote the equation. His handwriting, less ornate than hers, was imbued with clarity and precision. "The error," he explained in a measured tone that resonated through the silence, "lies in applying the transformation incorrectly. You carried the coefficient outside too early, altering the integral limits. Solved correctly, the function remains intact." A heavy silence followed his explanation, punctuated only by the soft scratch of chalk against the board. Professor Cartwright's jaw tightened as she re-examined her work. For a fleeting moment, hope sparked in the room, maybe she would concede. Instead, her lips curled into a tight smile as she retorted, "Well, Mr. Reed, since you seem so confident, why don't you come up here and show us the correct method?" The challenge was not posed out of genuine inquiry but as a calculated snare meant to unsettle him, and a few snickering whispers betrayed the unspoken intent to embarrass him publicly. Daniel, undeterred, placed his notebook on the desk and walked to the front with quiet dignity. Accepting the chalk from her outstretched hand, he felt the collective gaze of his classmates, an amalgam of admiration, curiosity, and latent envy, settle upon him. With each smooth, deliberate mark he made on the board, his correction unfurled like a well-rehearsed symphony. Every number, every symbol, aligned perfectly as he narrated his reasoning with calm precision. The misstep, he reiterated softly, occurred when the coefficient was prematurely externalized, thereby shifting the integral's bounds. Applied correctly, the transform preserves the function's integrity. By the time he set the chalk aside, the atmosphere had transformed into one of hushed awe. Professor Cartwright stood rigid, her arms crossed and expression unreadable, a mask that belied the inner tumult of a teacher unaccustomed to being corrected. After a long, measured pause, she sighed, "Fine. You've corrected it, congratulations." No warmth accompanied her words, it was an acknowledgement stripped of praise. Daniel returned to his seat, absorbing the mixture of impressed stares and resentful glances. He wasn't performing for accolades, he simply could not abide error. Yet the day's trials were far from over. With a brisk wave of her hand, Professor Cartwright wiped away Daniel's work and began inscribing an even longer, more daunting equation. The sprawling set of integrals, limits, and intricate differential components sprawled across half the board like a gauntlet designed for the faint-hearted. "Since you possess such keen eyes," she challenged, "solve this." The classroom tensed, every student anticipating the spectacle of his potential failure. Daniel's heart thumped steadily as he recognized the trap, a test not meant for his intellect but for his composure under pressure. He exhaled slowly and strode back to the board. As he picked up the chalk, a few under-the-breath chuckles rippled among his peers, expecting him to falter. But Daniel's mind was already a cascade of solutions. Each stroke was measured and confident, the symbols yielded to his natural intuition as if they had no choice but to obey. His explanations flowed seamlessly, punctuated only by the rhythmic scratching of chalk against the board, until finally he underlined his final answer with a decisive flourish. A deep, consuming silence enveloped the room, only to be broken by a solitary low whistle from the back. Professor Cartwright's face remained inscrutable as she meticulously scanned his work, searching desperately for a flaw, a detail that might allow her to reassert her dominance. Yet there was nothing to be found. His solution was not merely correct but possessed an elegance that left little room for dispute. A murmur of astonishment rose among the students, their eyes now fixed on Daniel with newfound respect and quiet awe. After what felt like an eternity, the professor's voice broke the silence, clipped and tense. "Lucky guess," she muttered, though the room's reaction suggested otherwise. Daniel merely tilted his head, silently affirming that his success was no mere stroke of fortune. With a final, sharp exhalation, she dismissed him with a terse, "Sit down, Mr. Reed." As he returned to his seat, the shift in the room was palpable, admiration mingled with resentment, and even the professor's gaze hinted at something unspoken, an unsettling mixture of defeat and reluctant recognition. The energy in the hall had irrevocably changed. No longer did the students view Professor Cartwright as an unassailable force, instead, they saw a woman struggling to reclaim her authority. Gathering herself, she resumed her lecture with a noticeably tighter grip on the chalk, her voice now stripped of its usual commanding timbre. Mid-sentence, she paused, then fixed her eyes on Daniel once more. "If you're so confident, Mr. Reed," she said, forcing a smile that barely masked her irritation, "how about we raise the stakes?" A ripple of anticipation surged through the room. Daniel's pulse quickened as the professor advanced toward her desk and produced a thick, weathered textbook. Flipping through its pages with theatrical precision, she halted at a section buried deep within, a problem that belonged to the realm of advanced graduate studies. Holding the book aloft so every student could see, she tapped a particularly formidable equation. "This problem," she declared, "is extracted from a course designed for advanced scholars, a challenge I wouldn't expect any undergraduate to conquer. But since you exhibit such a natural aptitude, why don't you prove it?" Her smile was too sharp, her eyes too cold, betraying that this was less an offer than a calculated maneuver to break him. Daniel's heart pounded as he absorbed her challenge. He knew this was no genuine academic opportunity, it was a test of his mettle under public pressure, a power play aimed at exposing any crack in his resolve. Refusal, he realized, would mark him as a lucky anomaly rather than a true genius. And so, with a measured exhale and a determined nod, he accepted. "Once I'm in," he resolved silently, his eyes speaking volumes of a challenge he was prepared to meet. Word of his acceptance spread swiftly through the hallways. As Daniel stepped out of the lecture room, hushed conversations followed him like a trail of whispered legends. Some offered respectful nods, others eyed him as one might regard an athlete on the brink of a championship match. In the solitude of the university library, surrounded by towers of textbooks, scribbled calculations, and a long-forgotten cup of cooling coffee, Daniel immersed himself in preparation. Math was his sanctuary, and now every late-night study session, every flicker of insight under the dim lamp, became a battle against the looming pressure of a competition that was months away. In that crucible of relentless study, a familiar presence appeared. Brian, a fellow scholar with an irreverent smile, joined him at a table cluttered with notes and equations. "You're already miles ahead of half the competitors," Brian remarked with a sly grin, hinting that perhaps Professor Cartwright's true motive was to retaliate for her bruised pride. Their quiet exchange was laden with mutual respect and an unspoken vow, a pledge to defy expectations and prove that true genius could not be tamed by authority. For weeks later, the setting shifted to a vast auditorium at another esteemed institution. Under glaring spotlights and before a panel of stern-faced judges, Daniel found himself seated among a sea of competitors. A towering digital timer loomed above the stage like a relentless overseer, counting down the moments of a contest that would determine his fate. Each competitor's desk was strewn with scratch paper and pens, all summoned by a single, uncompromising directive: solve the problems faster and more accurately than anyone else. In the opening round, where mental arithmetic reigned supreme, Daniel's fingers danced over his response device with unwavering speed and precision. While others hesitated and second-guessed, he flowed effortlessly from one calculation to the next. The subsequent rounds demanded not only raw speed but also the elegant unraveling of complex theories and proofs, a stage on which Daniel's innate intuition shone. Numbers transformed into rhythmic patterns and interlocking structures under his gaze, each problem a stepping stone on his inexorable ascent up the leaderboard. As the contest reached its climax, only two competitors remained in serious contention: Daniel and a determined candidate from a renowned technical institute. The final challenge appeared on the screen, a labyrinthine problem of nested integrals and summations crafted to test every ounce of endurance and intellect. In the final, excruciating seconds, time seemed to stretch into infinity. Daniel's heart thundered in his ears, yet his mind remained serenely focused. With his pen gripped as though it were a magic wand, he raced through the layers of complexity. Each step was executed with flawless precision until, with a final, confident stroke, he boxed his answer. The timer buzzed, and for a suspended moment the room lay in a silence so deep it was almost tangible. One judge then rose and examined both answers with a deliberate, methodical air. After what felt like an eternity, the judge's voice finally cut through the tension: "The winner of this year's mathematics symposium is Daniel Reed." The announcement exploded into a cacophony of applause, gasps, and murmurs of disbelief. For Daniel, the triumph was not merely over rival competitors, it was a resounding refutation of every doubt cast upon him, a reclaiming of his identity against every expectation that had sought to confine him. In the midst of the celebration, Daniel's eyes met those of Professor Cartwright for the first time since that fateful lecture. In her gaze, he discerned an unspoken reassessment, a reluctant acknowledgement that the truth, as spoken by numbers, was unassailable. Though her face remained stoically composed, the subtle shift in her expression conveyed that her authority had been irrevocably undermined. The following morning in the lecture hall, as Daniel settled into his customary seat, the air itself seemed charged with a newfound reverence. Moments later, Professor Cartwright entered with her habitual composure, yet when her gaze swept the room, it lingered on him with something akin to respect. Clearing her throat with deliberate formality, she addressed the class: "Before we begin today's lecture, I wish to acknowledge that Daniel Reed secured first place in a recent competition against some of our nation's brightest mathematical minds." A hush fell over the room, punctuated only by a few discreet claps and a knowing smile from Brian. There were no grandiose accolades, just a sparse, measured admission of fact that carried more weight than any elaborate praise could. In that quiet moment, Daniel realized that his victory had not been a public spectacle to satisfy another's ego, but a personal triumph, a silent, undeniable proof that excellence endures even under the harshest scrutiny. The lesson was as clear as the equations on the board: sometimes the most powerful way to change perceptions isn't through words or boasts, but through the unyielding language of truth. As the lecture resumed and the chalk resumed its dance across the board, the echoes of that transformative day lingered like a promise in the minds of all who had witnessed it, a promise that brilliance, when allowed to speak for itself, can redefine the very nature of authority.